Hello, friends. Welcome to Winter at St. Andrew. It is my privilege to welcome you here today from the beautiful St. Andrew Sanctuary. I am grateful, as always, to share this sacred online space with you, where we are all invited, included, and valued as vital and beloved members of our broader worshiping community. With its long nights and quiet days, winter invites us into new rhythms and routines that make possible the rest, renewal, and rootedness our bodies and souls long for. What appears to be a season of dormancy is a time of stillness and hidden growth, essential to all of life. At St. Andrew, we offer an abundance of opportunities throughout this season for self-care, spiritual growth, finding community, and serving others. You can visit gostandrew.com/winter for more information. We are proud to be an open, affirming, inclusive congregation that welcomes all people into the full life and communion of our church. This includes saints and sinners, believers and skeptics, the lost and the found, the wanderers and the wanderers, families of all shapes and sizes, and people from every point along life's journey. No matter who you are or where you've been, no matter what you believe or even if you believe anything at all, you are welcome at St. Andrew and you belong here. If you have any questions about our church, prayer requests for our care team, or if you would like to get in touch with a member of our pastoral team or staff, please email info@gostandrew.com. If you would like to explore deeper engagement with the St. Andrew community through our many classes, group life gatherings, and service opportunities, you can email us directly at connect@gostandrew.com. We'd love to hear from you. Just as a reminder, our full Sunday morning worship services, complete with music, prayer, announcements, liturgy, ministry spotlights, and the sermon, are live streamed on our YouTube page each week and permanently archived for viewing anytime. Lastly, to contribute a financial gift to the work and ministry of St. Andrew, you can always visit gostandrew.com/give or text St. Andrew to 28950. And now let's listen together to this week's scripture and sermon.
A reading from 1 John chapter 4, verses 19 through 21. We love because God first loved us. Those who say, I love God, and hate a brother or sister are liars. For those who do not love a brother or sister whom they have seen cannot love God, whom they have not seen. The commandment we have from him is this: those who love God must love their brothers and sisters also.
So, where are you from? It's one of the first questions you're asked whenever you meet someone for the first time. Where are you from? Imagine that your spouse drags you to some party or social event with people you don't know and tells you to pretend like you really want to be there. And so you meet a stranger, you shake hands, exchange names, maybe mention who you're with or who you know or how you're really enjoying the shrimp cocktail and antipasto skewers with sun-dried tomatoes, because you're an introvert and this is super awkward and this stranger has you cornered and all you really want now is to just go home. But this stranger is a big-time extrovert who's not picking up on your overtly reclusive vibe, and he really wants to be your new best friend, which is why he asks you that one complicated, deeply personal question. So where are you from? And this is the exact moment when your night just got unbearably longer. What is it about naming where we're from that seems to reveal so much about who we are, our identity, our story, maybe even our values or worldview? If someone says they're from Manhattan or Chicago or San Francisco, what does that say about them? What if they're from Aspen or Compton, Maui or Enid? Does knowing this information give you any insight into who they are? I moved from San Diego to Colorado about 10 years ago, but if you ask me where I'm from originally, I'll tell you that I was raised in a little town called Yucaipa, California. And if you knew anything about Yucaipa, your next question would probably be, which trailer park? Where we come from reveals something about who we are. Not everything, of course, but where we come from, our place, our family, tribe of origin, always reveals something about us. This is why we spit in a tube and ship it to a lab to have our DNA analyzed. We want to know where we've come from. It's why some who were adopted, maybe as children, might seek out information about their biological parents, curious about where and who they've come from. It's why we pass down heirlooms and create family trees and visit cemeteries of our ancestors to remember where we've come from. Where are you from? It's a question as old as humanity itself. Every culture, every tribe, every people from every corner of the earth has sought an answer to that question. We all want to know our origin story, and not just the story of our own families or tribes of origin, but the story that takes us all the way back to where it all started, where we all originally came from. For Jews and Christians, the first book of the Bible, the book of Genesis, is an origin story. The book of Genesis gets its title from its opening line, "in the beginning." In the Greek, Genesis means beginning. And the first 2 chapters of Genesis describe in beautiful metaphor and poetic verse our beginning, our starting point, where we all come from. These creation stories were never meant to be read literally. To read them as actual history would be to rob them of their artistic beauty and evocative mythos. Jews and Christians believe these first 2 chapters of Genesis transcend historical fact to reveal deeper, more enduring truths about where we come from. But while Genesis is the first book in the Bible, it's not actually the oldest book in the Bible. Most scholars believe the first 2 chapters of Genesis were likely composed in their present form sometime around 500 BCE, and that, in fact, they reflect 2 different accounts of our origin story. Scholars believe they were written during the period of Jewish exile, sometime after the Jews had been conquered by the Babylonians. After their defeat, some of the surviving Jews were left behind in the rubble of Jerusalem, but the poets and artisans, priests and thought leaders were carted off to Babylon, where they lived in exile for 70 years. And while in exile, they were exposed to the creation stories of their pagan captors. One of the most popular creation stories of that time was what the Babylonians called the Enuma Elish. And that story says that the creation of the world took place after a great battle between 2 gods, one male and the other female. And in that creation story, the male god kills the female god, and then, sadly, tears her body apart. And then he uses one half of her body to create the heavens and the other half to create the earth. It's not exactly a picker-upper kind of origin story, is it? Maybe that's why the Babylonians were such a cruel and violent people, because their origin story told them that they'd come from cruelty and violence. According to their origin story, the whole engine of their universe was fueled from the very beginning by brutality, and carnage, destruction. This was their starting point. This is where they came from. The forces that gave their universe life were violence and bloodshed and death. It was only when the Jews were captive in Babylon, it was only when they were exposed to this violent origin story that they decided to record their own creation stories, which had been passed down by countless generations before them through oral tradition. They wrote down what they could remember from what their ancestors told them. And the stories that they recorded 2,500 years ago now appear as the first 2 chapters of Genesis. 2 origin stories that, taken together, offered a counter-narrative to the dominant and violent creation stories that the Babylonians were telling. Instead of stories about creation out of bloodshed and severed body parts, The Jewish captives wrote about a generous God who breathes his own spirit into creation and forms the universe out of love. And then over and over again calls everything good. These became the origin stories that defined the captive Jews, giving them a unique identity among the many foreign influences. At the time, these stories answered the question of whether the engine of the universe was violence and destruction or love and goodness. It remains an urgent question for us even today. When we ask ourselves where we're from, what we're really asking is what deep forces within us are fueling our lives. We're asking if our starting point in life is love and goodness or fear and hatred. The Jews had to answer this question in exile, and every generation ever since must answer it in their own time and place. Because isn't it true that how our story begins invariably shapes how it might end? That where we start from inevitably influences where we're going. Every generation must choose between at least two competing narratives. One that starts with hatred and violence, or one that starts with love and goodness. Our creation story says that our starting place is goodness and love. We were created in the very image and likeness of a good and loving God who says in the creation story, "Let us make humans in our image, according to our likeness." We each in our own unique and diverse ways bear the image and likeness of a good and loving God. Have you ever looked in the mirror and seen your mother's likeness? Maybe in your eyes, your chin, the way you hold your shoulders. Have you ever looked at your hands or the way your hair sticks up on one side, or how your eyebrows sometimes grow wild and super bushy? And maybe you can see something of your father or grandfather or uncle right there in yourself. In such moments, we remember where we come from. Our origin story says it works that way with God. We are made in the image and likeness of our Creator, who is good and loving. For centuries, this concept has been called Imago Dei. It's a foundational doctrine central to both Judaism and Christianity. Imago Dei, it means essentially that we were created out of divine love and goodness and are forever seen by God as lovely, good, and worthy. In the creation poem of Genesis 1, God sits back at the end of each day of creation and calls it good. God creates light and calls it good. God creates the sky and calls it good. God creates the seas, the earth, vegetation, night and day, creatures and animals, and finally humans, and calls it all good. 5 times in Genesis 1, God calls it all good until the 6th day. God calls it all very good. Everything starts from a place of goodness. And if it's true that where we start from inevitably influences where we're going, then our origin story that starts with love and goodness promises over time to lead to fuller expressions of love and goodness. But while it sounds logical and hopeful, this is not our guiding narrative in the modern world. The image we often have of ourselves is far different from the Imago Dei described in our origin story. That image and likeness of God that makes us lovely and worthy is often obscured and disfigured by the forces of shame. Shame is a universal experience, but it's not a product of our origin story, nor is it a characteristic of the Imago Dei. Sociologist Brené Brown has spent her whole career studying the destructive effects of shame. She defines shame as the intensely painful feeling or experience of believing that we are flawed and therefore unworthy of love and belonging. Something we've experienced or done or failed to do makes us unworthy of connection. Shame is different than guilt. We've all experienced guilt in our lives. We blow it. We do harm to others or to ourselves. We trip up. We miss the mark. We stumble. And we experience in that moment the sadness and remorse for having done something we wish we hadn't done. Guilt says to us, what you did was wrong. And that is often the catalyst for change and reconciliation, even transformation. It reminds us that we can do better. But shame is different. Shame is that harsh inner critic that tells us we're never good enough, no matter how hard we try. Instead of telling us what you did was wrong, it says who you are is wrong. Shame comes from within and without, but it never, ever comes from God. It comes most naturally from this invisible but overactive disapproval gland that we all have within us. It's fueled by past traumas that are never healed, broken relationships that are never reconciled, forgiveness that is never asked for or granted, weaknesses that are never befriended, and the shadows that we keep hidden from the light of God's grace. Our disapproval gland can become so overactive that it controls our lives, how we perceive ourselves and others, even God, until eventually we convince ourselves that we are just too flawed to be fixed. But this kind of shame can be healed. It can be healed by good people in safe spaces where grace abounds in community, accountability, prayer, vulnerability and honesty, and maybe therapy. But what makes the shame we all feel from time to time even more unbearable is toxic religion. That is, forms of religion, especially Christianity, that tell us God is inherently disappointed in us. For too many Christians, this narrative of divine disappointment and disapproval is their origin story. It's been handed down over the centuries in the form of a doctrine that's called original sin, which stands in direct contradiction to the doctrine of Imago Dei. The phrase original sin is found nowhere in the Bible. It's completely rejected by Judaism. It's a uniquely Christian concept and a pretty toxic one. It originates from a single verse found in Paul's epistle to the Romans, in which Paul references the story of Adam in Genesis 3, when Adam famously disobeys God's command to not eat of the fruit of the tree of knowledge. In this one verse, Paul, the apostle, implies that this was how sin and death first came into the world, through Adam's willful act of disobedience. But it wasn't until the 4th century that a bishop by the name of Augustine coined this concept called original sin. Augustine said that at the very moment Adam ate that forbidden fruit in the garden, all of humanity became fallen in nature. Adam's sin was the original sin that permanently separates us from God. We all have this in us, even newborns at the moment of birth, even babies in cute little onesies, they're all corrupt. Much later, theologians like Calvin piled on, saying that ever since Adam's act of disobedience, we suffer from what he called total depravity. God's wrath is ever against us now, and there's nothing by our own power that we can do to appease that wrath and to bridge the eternal chasm between us and God, except, of course, to accept Jesus as the atoning sacrifice for the punishment of sin that we deserve. Over the centuries, original sin somehow became Christianity's dominant origin story. Christians completely skipped over the story of the love and goodness of God in Genesis 1 and 2 and went straight to the sinfulness and disobedience of Adam in Genesis 3. In doing so, we forsook imago Dei for original sin. And we stopped seeing ourselves as created in the image and likeness of a good and loving God, and we grew deaf to God's pronouncement that we are very good. And we turned God into a judge and condemner instead of our lover and creator. And then we turned Jesus into a solution to our sin and shame instead of the way and truth and life that can transform our sin and shame. Maybe this is why there are so many unhealthy and unhappy Christians and so many former Christians in the world and more people who'd never even want to become a Christian. Because if we start from a place of sinfulness and divine disapproval, we'll likely end always in shame. If we don't start from love and goodness, it's hard to be perfected by love and goodness. If we turn Jesus into a mere solution to our problems, we'll never really learn how to transform our problems by His very power and grace. We will only continue to experience more shame and more fear. Isn't that the message of 1 John 4? The writer says God is love, and those who abide in love abide in God, and God abides in them. And there is no fear in love, but perfect love casts out fear. For fear has to do with punishment. And whoever fears has not reached perfection in love. We love because He first loved us. God is too busy loving us to ever feel disappointment with us. David Roche is the self-proclaimed pastor of what he calls the Church of 80% Sincerity. His mission is to help people believe they are loved and lovable at least 80% of the time. He uses his own life story to convert people. Roche was born with a large benign tumor on the bottom left quadrant of his face. Surgeons removed it when he was a child. In the process, they removed his lower lip and gave him such extensive radiation that the lower part of his face stopped growing, and he was covered with plum-colored burns. He's now in his 60s, and he speaks about the hidden, scarred parts inside all of us, the fear and shame deep inside that says we are unlovely. Roche says everyone has the fear of being in some way defective, unlovable, unacceptable to society. That is the true disfigurement, he says. Countless times every day we are driven to moments when we turn away from our own images in dismay and despair. Our sense of self-worth is constantly assailed and eroded. Every person, he says, no matter what their appearance, must reach the point of self-acceptance. That magical moment, he says, is the key to living an integrated and full life. The good news that leads us to that self-acceptance is this: we love because God first loved us. We can love ourselves and we can love others because from the very beginning, God first loved us. It's the last and most important of our conjunctions, because. But maybe it's the hardest of all to accept and believe. Our takeaways for today, our starting point is divine love and goodness. We each bear the unique image and likeness of God. We can love ourselves and others because God first loved us.